Today you'll meet Pat Scott. Pat Scott has experienced the horrible ordeal of violent crime against her and her husband Bob. Bob was murdered during a robbery in the driveway of their own home. And Pat has faced the difficult consequences of this violent crime. But she's emerged from that darkness, and she reaches out to help other victims. Hello, I'm Randy Beckton. Welcome to Hope for Life's Journey. Our government statistics tell us that 1 in every 12 of us can expect to be a victim of crime in our lifetime. Is there any way that we can avoid becoming a statistic? Are there any disciplines that we could follow that will better prepare us to live through these personal tough times, whatever they might be? Pat Scott suggests in a new book that we need to batten down the hatches. Well, how do we do that? We'll visit in just a moment.
Welcome to Hope for Life's Journey, bringing real hope and real answers to real life. A presentation of Herald of Truth Ministries.
Pat Scott, something happened to you and your husband Bob at 8:30 on a March night. Tell us about it.
My husband and I had just gone out for an evening of shopping and out to dinner, and as we were returning home and pulled into the driveway of our home, I exited my side of the car, and as I did so, a man grabbed me around the neck, put a gun in my face, and demanded my jewelry. I readily gave him my jewelry, and then he pushed me out onto the driveway where, by that time, my husband was standing, and he demanded my husband's wallet and his jewelry, and almost simultaneously with that demand, the clip fell from his weapon, and bullets just fell all over that driveway. The gunman ran over and scooped up the clip, and I think maybe a few of the bullets, and he turned around and charged toward my husband. And I heard that loud cracking sound of the gun discharging, and my husband dropped to the ground. Technically, my husband lived 14 hours, but he never regained consciousness. The gunman ran, and I ran the opposite direction to get a neighbor to call 911.
Victim of violence. Yes. Sadly, you're not in a small group of people. There are a lot of people now that are becoming victims of violent crime, but it's as fresh to you as if it was last night, isn't it?
Yes.
And it changed your life forever. It changed your relationship with the world in some ways because it was a violation of a safe place. Your own home, your own driveway, your own garage. Right. What have you done in thinking about safety since that time?
Well, that initial incident was only the beginning, because after that, my own life was threatened. And I had to have a female police officer move into my home and live there for 3 months. A lot of security. So I was taught a lot about security.
Now, this is because you had seen the perpetrators,
yes,
right?
Yes.
All right. And you were a threat.
Yes. And so I know a lot about safety, things that I didn't formerly know. I know a lot of police officers today that I didn't know before.
Now, eventually, the ones who did this were caught.
They were.
They were put on trial, and they were convicted.
That's true.
In prison now, right?
Yes.
But while that is justice and that is what needed to happen, that doesn't change the ripping and the tearing that happened in your life. What has really changed? Everything?
Everything. Life will never be what it was, and I will never be who I was. When you've experienced that kind of violence and that kind of loss, you're never the same person again, I think.
Well, people think sometimes, Pat, that after you do experience something like this, you just sit down and you write a book, and you go on a book circuit, and life goes on then. But this book relives all the time your dialogue with God, your discussions about the impact of losing Bob. Bob was respected and loved by so many people. Your story was in newspapers around this nation. You couldn't get away from it if you tried to get away from it, could you?
No, I could not. In fact, I was almost a prisoner in my own home for a while with the media frenzy.
Why did you say batten down the hatches? Is this something that was given to you, or does this come out of you?
That came from me.
All right.
I finally came up with that title because I wanted that book to be about preparing for life storms.
Can you do that?
That's a question many people ask. And in one level, I guess you really can't. But there is a level on which you can. I believe that we can grow our relationship and our trust with God, and that is preparation for a storm in itself. That served me so well. There are other traits that we can put into our lives, traits that actually are suggested in Scripture, like self-control and being optimistic and having tenacity and perseverance, those things that will really serve us well when the storms do come.
I want to ask your daughter, Michelle Tucker, who's visiting with us here on the set. Michelle, not only did you lose your dad, but you had to watch your mother going through this. In so many ways, she really was well prepared to handle difficulty, wasn't she?
We were. We both felt like had been specially prepared by God in a lot of ways to carry the burden that we were asked to carry. But it was very frightening as well because not only had I lost my dad, but I was very afraid that I might emotionally lose my mother. I mean, it wouldn't have been unheard of if she'd had serious emotional trouble afterwards.
She could have closed down on the world and on anything.
Right. And, I mean, people that have guns held to their head, I mean, that's a very hard thing. But she never even had a nightmare. And so we were really fortunate.
Now, you understand this more than a lot of people do because you're finishing your training as a primary care physician, and you know about the connection between what happens to us and our minds and what we think about. So you really had lots of reasons to be concerned about your mom, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I really did. But all I can tell you is that in almost a very surreal way, it was almost as every step of every day we were cared for by God. And there were ways that we could see that God was taking care of us, even as we were taking step by step, one step at a time, which is what you have to do when you're in a storm like that.
Pat, talk about one step at a time. How do you do it? Because everyone who knows you really believes you do this so well. What is this? How do you do it?
Well, when you're in a situation like that, or any grieving process even, to look too far down the road is disastrous because it frightens you. But you can handle one day at a time, one incident at a time with God's help.
You talked about preparation for crisis, but now you're in the role of talking to other people who are widowers and widows due to various circumstances that take their loved one. What do you tell them will help them most with their grief and their sense of loss, the great pain that just stays there?
Well, there isn't one thing. Everyone in the grief process really comes from a different background, and you can't say one formula for every person. But I always encourage them to trust God, to see them through it, because that is one thing that is universal.
Yes. Bob was a precious man. How many years were you married to him?
36.
You have a prominent picture of him in the house where you go and come all the time?
Yes.
You're still living in the same house?
I am.
Answering your mail and picking up your phone. What's the hardest part of the day for you?
Well, today, my life is so different. I am not home very much. I'm traveling quite a bit and speaking, and so I don't have a routine life anymore. You know, originally, the hard part of the day is the time of day that he would have been there. But now my life has changed so much that that really isn't so much a factor anymore.
Do you have many flashbacks when you pull in that driveway?
Not too many. Occasionally I do. Occasionally, even when I walk into the garage, I think, this is where I stood.
You know, a lot of people think that you help someone who've had the loss by not mentioning the person. But now, you and your daughter, Michelle, is that the way you deal with her dad and your husband's memory? Do you say, let's don't talk, or do you do the opposite?
Not at all. We do the opposite. I had friends originally who said, you know, we're grieving his loss too. If it doesn't bother you too much, we'd like to talk about him. And that was wonderful for me. I like it, and I think all people who have had a loss like to talk about their loved one that they've lost, that's very beneficial. So we should do that.
What does it do when you think about Jesus' words, I am the resurrection? Does that light you up?
Oh, yes, it does. It is.
Do you think more about heaven? Do you think more about heaven?
Oh, much more about heaven, yes.
And you're still very young, but you're thinking a lot more about heaven.
Heaven is much sweeter than it ever was. It's much more real to me than it ever was.
Yes.
Yes.
You're taking opportunities to help other people. But this problem of violence, it is just frightening everyone, isn't it?
Yes.
What's going to be the real rock bottom solution to all this violence, especially among our young?
Well, I'm not sure that I can give you a rock bottom solution, but other than God himself, I think that Christians and people who love God and believe in him must stand strong and reach out to others, reach out to the upcoming generation and encourage them to know God, because that's what's going to make the difference.
I know everyone, when you're talking in various places, wants to know about the person who's in prison, who perpetrated this crime. And usually they'll ask you, I would suspicion, about whether you've forgiven this person or not. Just tell our viewers how you deal with that.
Oh, yes, I have forgiven him. I've been very blessed that I haven't had to feel any anger and vengeance and bitterness about him. It has not been something that even from the beginning, I didn't really dwell on that. And so it has not been a problem to forgive him. He is in prison, and if some prison minister were to reach out to him and teach him and convert him, I would be very pleased.
Michelle, do you feel the same way your mother feels about this person?
Yes, I was very fortunate, and God led, I think, to almost see him as a person from almost the first weeks. And I felt a lot of love and compassion towards him. And I feel like the same thing, if he were able to be reached, that he would be just as saved as any of us if he were able to accept Jesus Christ. And I hope that happens.
So the ultimate tragedy really would be if this young life does not come to Jesus Christ. So we're going to pray that he does. Pat, what do you say to someone who says, well, my life was ripped apart by violence too? It may have been one of their children. It may have been their father or their mother or their spouse.
Right. People who have had violence often are left with a lot of fear and insecurity. Fear is the most common one, I think. And they don't sleep well, and they have those nightmares that I was so blessed not to have. I think I would say to them what Jesus said, fear not him who can kill the body, and after that can do no more. Fear him who after killing the body can cause you to be thrown into hell. That's whom you should fear. Right. And that is the real cause for fear.
We're visiting with Pat Scott and her daughter, Michelle Tucker, about the tragic loss of Bob, her husband, who was murdered. And Pat and Michelle have been putting the pieces back together of their life, and with the strength of God, you've been doing a marvelous job, and you're helping so many of the rest of us to deal with things that we didn't know how to cope with. Visiting with us on our set today is Bobby Moore. Bobby, you talk to a lot of young people about preparing for real life and meeting real life with real faith. Could you take us somewhere in the Word of God that would deepen and anchor our faith so that when these kinds of tragedies hit, at least we have some kind of preparation?
Randy, I'm just so mindful of how much death there is that surrounds us and how much we lose people that we love. And as I think about that, I think of a story in the Bible where Jesus talks about one of his best friends, his friend named Lazarus, who was sick and was about to just pass away. Word came back that Lazarus did pass away, and he began to go to see them. And as he was walking down the road, Martha came running to see him, and she screamed out to Jesus, Jesus, if you would have just been here, my brother would still be alive. Just the faith that she had. And he looked at her and he said, as you said earlier, I am the resurrection. And he does have life even after death. But as Martha found that out, she began to run back and tell Mary that Jesus was here. And here's what I want you to see with this part. When Mary comes running out of the house, the first thing she does is her tears are just just make her fall at Jesus' feet. And as she is there at Jesus' feet, she just begins to cry. And that's the time that we see Jesus crying for his friend, because he's moved because of what a close friendship he had and what a loss that was for him. But you see, Jesus has the power to heal. Maybe it's not a resurrection as today, and we can't bring Bob back today in this life. But Pat, as you said, you're so looking forward to heaven. And I just am so mindful as Jesus began to walk to that tomb, he was moved again. And I don't know if that movement was because of the loss of his best friend, or maybe he got to thinking about that's how he was going to have to die. That's where he was going to lay. And that was just part of death that he was going to have to overcome. Or maybe he even got to thinking of Adam and Eve and how they lost that perfect place that they could have through sin. And they were hurting. And Jesus sits there and he knows the power that he has. And Pat, I see you just at the feet of Jesus. And Pat, I see you there. And I want everybody to know that when they feel that pain, Jesus is right there crying with you. And it's time to batten down our hatches. But we need to batten down our hatches with the Lord and sitting right there, because he's going to be our co-pilot. He's the one that's going to lead us where we need to go. And we have to have that faith. You know, you see Pat here, and as you see her sharing her story, you know where her trust is.
Right.
You know where her heart is. And you know the love that she has for Jesus.
You haven't been grieving alone, even from the first word, have you?
No, I have not. I've had so much support from people. But of course, I consider that God too. God uses us to pour out his love.
That's right.
And people have done that for me so richly.
Is that why you've made yourself available to other people?
Yes. Well, I love people. I was a people person before this. But I now know that I have a new credibility that I would not have had this not happened to me.
That's right.
And it's more meaningful when I tell them something today than it was before I had storms in my own life.
We talk about storms. Bobby, we talk about boats, water that's really rough and about to draw us under like a current can do. Think of something in the Bible that really solidifies our confidence in Jesus Christ in the storms of life.
Pat shared that she had a faith that she had already been building up. And when this tragedy happened, she had that faith in Jesus already. I'm mindful of a guy named Peter, and boy, what a fisherman he was and what a great guy he was. And one day Jesus was walking out on the water, and everybody on that boat was beginning to be afraid, and they thought there was a ghost out there. I mean, they were just so afraid what was coming after them. And then finally Jesus says, "It's me, I'm coming, it's Jesus, I'm walking out there." And Peter says, "Jesus, if it's really you, let me come out there to you." Because he had the faith in Jesus. And as he began to step over that boat, there was a storm going on. But as he began to walk, he began to see the waves. And as the waves were crashing around him and about to take him under, he lost focus. He lost looking to Jesus, and he began to sink. And Jesus had to reach out and pick him back up and pull him back in and carry him back to that boat. And as they both got back on that boat, the sea was calm. And I think so many times, Randy, we have people that are sitting out there today that have lost a loved one, that have a son or a daughter that are addicted to drugs, that we just have people out there that are hurting, and they think, my faith is good enough, but when the waves are crashing around them, the first thing they do is lose that faith. But what's awesome is Jesus is reaching his hand out and pulling them back up and saying, "Walk with me, because I can calm the storm."
A man said to me one time, "Randy, it's hard for me to stay focused on God in my eyes when they're so filled with tears." Have you been crying and noticed that you can't focus clearly when you're just crying because the tears tend to cloud up the reality that you're looking at? He was saying it's hard, Bobby. And you're not saying it's easy.
That's right.
But you're saying that Jesus will reach and pick you up if you'll just keep looking to him.
That's right.
I think that may be easy to say. It's kind of hard to do, isn't it, Pat?
It may be a little hard to do, however, for me it seemed to come so naturally. Where else would one turn when circumstances are so violent and unthinkable? I remember distinctly going into my bedroom the night that my life was threatened. And I prayed that night, and I prayed, Lord, this man wants to kill me, and he probably can, even in spite of all this security, if he wants to. It's all in your hands. And that prayer just left me feeling so peaceful. I went straight to bed that night and sound asleep.
Sounds like he could have killed you, but he couldn't have touched you.
Right.
Is that right?
Something like that.
Batten down the hatches. We're talking today about ways to prepare ourselves for life's difficulties. We're saying that there's a foundation decision that everybody needs to make. What is that decision, Bobby?
That decision is another violent crime that happened. And that decision is following a man that was hung on a cross. And the reason that Jesus died on a cross was so that we could have life. You see, he came to this earth as a sacrifice. He could have stayed in heaven with God. He could have stayed up there and just sat right there with God and let earth go on the way it was. But God went to his only son, looked him in the eyes and said, I need you to go down there and I need you to die. I need you to defeat death. And you see, Jesus was taken and he was beaten and he was laughed at and he was mocked. And he had one of his closest friends sell him out. He had Judas come and wrap his arms around him and hug him and tell the other people, this is the man who claims he's Christ. And he was arrested and beaten, and then he was hung on a cross. And as he hung there, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And Pat has said that for that young man. And she said, it's time for me to forgive because I have the hope of Jesus. And I have a love of the Father who wraps his arms around me.
So it's the decision about whether or not to take that sacrifice, that death, seriously and make it the focal point of your reason for living, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
That's right.
If you'll make that decision, then you don't have to be fearful. Is that right?
That's right.
Well, I think that today is a message that's going to live far beyond Hope for Life's Journey, this television ministry and outreach. I hope that those of you who've been listening to this conversation are encouraged that while a lot of things can happen to you, what is so important is what has happened before that inside of you. And if Jesus Christ is living inside of you, they really can't lay a hand on you. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely right.
Bobby, you have helped us today about this matter of trust and choosing trust over panic when the storms of our lives hit. Has it been that easy for you? Is it easier to teach it than it is sometimes to do it?
Sometimes it is.
Yeah.
And I know of people that hurt and people that have pain in their lives, and they sit there and they say, it's easy to hear it, but is it true? And just part of my family life, and I won't bring that up because we don't have time to go into it, but it is true.
And that's why you say it with such confidence and conviction.
Right.
You're saying it's true even if you don't feel it right now.
This world's not our home, and we're just trying to get through to make it to our true home. And it's time for us to rely on Christ because he's our Savior and he's the answer.
I think I see the peace in Bobby and the peace in Michelle also, and in you, Pat. It's almost an unsettling peace, isn't it? But it's also an instructive peace. And I want to thank you because I believe it's seeing Christ in you. Pat, as we have to conclude today, I want to ask you, are there any unresolved issues with this horrible tragedy?
Randy, I think I'm very blessed in that there were no unresolved issues. Many times there are in cases like that where there's no time to say goodbye. It's immediate, it's unexpected. But if we had said anything after he had been shot, if we had been able to, I don't know that it would have been anything that we had not already said.
Right.
So that gave me comfort too.
And that's really a suggestion, isn't it?
Yes.
To live each day having said what you need to say.
Absolutely.
To those that mean the most to you.
Absolutely, because none of us knows when that moment may have been the last moment that you're going to have with that person.
Thank you, Pat. I think the maturity and the wisdom that God has placed in you not only has come through in this book, but it's come through in our brief visit today, and I hope that you'll come back. I know you're working on a second book, and I know you're not ready to talk about it, but when you're finished, will you come back and visit?
I would love to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Bobby. I hope today's program has not been surrealistic to you, not been something that you think, well, that's over there, out yonder, that's this lady, she lives in another state, it doesn't have anything to do with me. You know about violence. Violence doesn't have any boundaries. It doesn't have any limits. It's going to affect all of us, and violence has lots of different forms. What we've said today on the program, though, is that there's a way through the storm. You can batten down your hatches by making a decision. The decision is Jesus Christ is the Lord of my life. Jesus Christ is the Savior of my life. I do want to follow Him. I do want to be a part of Him. I willingly accept the love of God offered in the cross of Jesus. I believe He was raised from the dead. You say, well, that's a lot of things to say, Randy. No, it boils down to this. Say yes. Yes, God, I accept your love in my life. Because while we were sinners, Christ died for us. And so the really important thing is, what are you going to do with that good news? It will take us through the violent times in our life. It'll take us through the dark hours. It will take you through the tears, those tears when you don't know how to focus on God. I believe today that this program is appropriately titled because Jesus Christ is hope. And I hope that you will be with us next time on Hope for Life's Journey. We'll see you then.